The fiddle stopped mid-note. Wilhelmina Hale stood at the edge of the barn dance, her carpetbag gripped in both hands, her ticket to the morning stage folded and tucked inside her corset where it pressed against her ribs like a secret accusation. She had said her goodbyes. She had shaken hands and smiled at the ranchers' wives and told little Bessie Cooper that she would write letters. She had done everything a woman does when she has decided that leaving is the only rational choice left to her. And then Marshal Oscar Kendrick had stepped out of the crowd. He was not a man who moved quickly. He never was. He crossed the packed dirt floor of the Hargrove barn with the deliberate, unhurried stride of a man who had learned long ago that rushing toward anything only made it run faster. The lantern light caught the star pin to his chest, catching sparks off it the way it caught sparks off everything hard and unyielding in this territory. His jaw was set, his gray eyes fixed on her with an expression she had never once seen on his face in the 9 months she had been in Redemption Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the year of our Lord 1883. He looked afraid. Oscar Kendrick, who had walked alone into the Delgado brothers' ambush with nothing but his Winchester and his nerve, looked afraid of a woman holding a carpetbag. He stopped 2 feet from her. The dancers had gone quiet. The fiddle player, old Pete Marsh, sat with his bow hovering above the strings like a man who understood that whatever was about to happen was not something you underscore with music. "One more song," Oscar said. His voice was low. It was the voice he used when everything mattered. "That's all I need. Stay for one more song, Wilhelmina." She stared at him. 9 months of carefully maintained distance. 9 months of tipped hats and polite nods and conversations that ended precisely where they should have ended. 9 months of him being the most solitary, most closed-off, most infuriatingly self-contained man she had ever encountered in all her 26 years, and this was what he chose. This moment. This impossible, heartbreaking, too-late moment. "The stage leaves at 7, she said. Her voice did not shake, which she considered one of the greatest achievements of her life. "I know when the stage leaves." He did not move. He did not reach for her. He just stood there, a man made of granite and regret, asking her for one song. "One more song is all I need." The barn held its breath. And Wilhelmina Hale, who had excellent reasons for leaving and a ticket that proved it, set down her carpetbag. She set it down slowly, the way you set down something you are not entirely sure you should let go of. And she looked at this man who had spent 9 months refusing to let her close enough to hurt him. And she thought about all the ways a single song could change everything, and all the ways it could change nothing at all. This is where it truly began, though neither of them would have said so. The beginning was months before, in the dust and heat of a June afternoon, when a stage rolled into Redemption Creek and Wilhelmina Hale stepped off it with her carpetbag and her schoolteacher's certificate, and her absolute conviction that New Mexico Territory was just a temporary stop, a brief chapter before real life resumed somewhere more civilized. She had been wrong about almost everything. The town of Redemption Creek sat in a valley between 2 low ridges of scrub-covered hills, positioned along a creek that actually ran water 8 months of the year, which made it something of a miracle in that dry country. It had a main street of packed caliche, a general store owned by Harold and Mabel Finch, a livery stable, a saloon called the Dusty Star, a church that doubled as a meeting hall, a doctor's office where Doc Emmett Sayers practiced medicine with whatever supplies the quarterly supply wagon brought, and a schoolhouse that had been without a teacher since the previous January when Miss Loretta Pruitt had abruptly married a cattle buyer from Texas and departed. It also had a marshal's office, a small stone building set slightly apart from the others, solid and square and almost aggressively unadorned, which suited its occupant perfectly. Wilhelmina had been hired through a letter exchange with the Redemption Creek Town Council, conducted over 4 months and negotiated with meticulous care on her part. She was from Cincinnati, Ohio, where she had taught at the Fairfield Avenue School for 3 years before the school consolidated, and her position was eliminated. She had no particular attachment to Ohio anymore, her parents having both passed within the same winter, taken by the same influenza that had swept through the city like a biblical judgment. She had a sister in San Francisco who kept writing letters suggesting she come west. She had taken that suggestion and moved it a little further east than her sister intended, because the position in Redemption Creek paid $12 a month plus a furnished room above the Finch General Store, and the position in San Francisco did not exist. She arrived in June of 1883 knowing precisely three things about her destination. It was remote, it was growing, and it needed a schoolteacher badly enough to write polite, earnest letters. What the letters had not mentioned was Oscar Kendrick. She met him on her first day, before she had even located her room above the store, when she walked into Mabel Finch's kitchen seeking directions, and found him sitting at the table drinking coffee, with the particular stillness of a man who occupied every space he entered, as though he had assessed it for threats and made peace with all of them. Mabel Finch, a brisk woman of 50 with magnificent gray hair pinned under a practical bonnet, made the introduction with the casual efficiency of a woman who understood that introductions were just a formality that the territory would take care of on its own terms. "This is Marshal Kendrick," Mabel said, setting down a fresh cup for Wilhelmina without asking whether she wanted it, which Wilhelmina found immediately admirable. "He keeps order in the town. Oscar, this is Miss Hale, the new schoolteacher." He had stood because he was that kind of man, and he had removed his hat because he was also that kind of man, and he had looked at her with those gray eyes that seemed to be cataloging everything about her for future reference, and he had said, "Miss Hale. Welcome to Redemption Creek." That was it, that was the whole of it. And then he had replaced his hat, picked up his coffee, and said something quiet to Mabel about whether the supply wagon had come in yet, and the conversation moved on, and Wilhelmina drank her coffee and thought that the Marshal of Redemption Creek was either extraordinarily composed or extraordinarily cold, and she was not sure which. Over the following weeks, she revised her assessment. He was not cold. Cold implied an absence of feeling. Oscar Kendrick was something more complicated than cold. He was self-contained in the way that a river is self-contained by its banks, the current moving fast and strong beneath a surface that appeared merely to reflect the sky. She saw him most mornings when he made his circuit of the town at dawn, a habit he had apparently maintained for the 7 years he had served as marshal. She saw him on Sunday mornings at the church, where he sat in the back pew and left before the singing, which Reverend Hollies accepted with a philosophical resignation that suggested this was an old negotiation. She saw him at town meetings, where he spoke rarely and precisely, and when he did speak, the room listened. She learned his history in pieces, the way you learn everything in a small town, through fragments dropped in conversation and never quite assembled into a complete picture. He was from Missouri. He had worked cattle before the war, served during it, and come west after. He had been Marshal of Redemption Creek for 7 years without a deputy and without complaint. He lived alone in the small stone house behind the marshal's office. He did not attend social events, or if he did, he attended them the way he attended church, briefly, and with an air of having discharged an obligation. He had been married once. This information came from Mabel Finch on a September evening when the two women were sitting on the porch above the store watching the last light leave the sky, and Mabel said it the way she said most things, simply and without embellishment, as though facts were simply facts and did not require emotional architecture to support them. "His wife died," Mabel said. "Fever. This was 4 years back. Clara, her name was. Sweet woman." She paused. "He hasn't been the same since. Well, he was never what you'd call easy before. But after Clara, he shut himself up good and tight, like a house in a storm." Wilhelmina had said she was sorry to hear it, and meant it, and they had sat in the cooling evening air and watched the stars come out over the dark ridges, and she had thought about a man who had closed all his windows against the wind, and whether the house inside stayed warm or just grew very still. She had not, at that point, let herself think about him as anything other than an interesting and somewhat melancholy fixture of this temporary town she was passing through. She was practical about these things. She was practical about most things. It was one of the qualities that had gotten her through the loss of her parents and the loss of her position and the general dismantling of the life she had expected to have. But the territory had other plans. It was a Thursday in late October when the first true shift occurred between them. She was walking back from the schoolhouse in the early evening, the children having stayed late to rehearse their recitation pieces, and she turned the corner onto Main Street to find a scene that made her heart stop and then restart at twice its former pace. 3 men she did not recognize were standing outside the Dusty Star Saloon, and one of them had his hand on the collar of Tom Briggs, the 14-year-old son of the Briggs family who farmed the north section, and Tom's face was the color of old linen, and the man holding him was saying things that were not words any child should hear. Before she had made a conscious decision, she was walking toward them. She heard Mabel call something from behind her, a warning or a protest, but she was already there, and she had placed herself between Tom Briggs and the man holding him with the absolute clarity of someone who knows exactly what they are doing and has not yet had time to be afraid of it. "Let the boy go," she said. The man looked at her. He was broad-shouldered and unshaved, and he looked at her the way men sometimes look at women in isolated places, with an assessment that was not respectful. "Stay out of this, teacher," he said. "I am going to ask you one more time," she said, and her voice was steady, which surprised her, "to let the boy go." And then she heard the specific sound of boot heels on packed dirt, unhurried and even, and she did not have to turn around to know who was behind her. "That'll be enough," Oscar said. The man with Tom looked up, and his expression changed in the way that expressions change when a man with a badge and a reputation enters a situation, like a cloud sliding in front of the sun. "Marshal," the man said. His hands had released Tom before his mouth had finished the word. What followed was quick and efficient and without drama, the way Oscar Kendrick handled most things. The 3 men were not from Redemption Creek. They were passing through, and they passed through faster than they had perhaps intended, escorted to their horses, and pointed toward the territory line with a brevity of words and a clarity of intent that required no elaboration. Tom Briggs went home with shaking legs and a story that he was already editing into something braver than the truth. Wilhelmina stood on the street in the cooling dark, her pulse still rapid, watching Oscar's broad back as he returned from watching the 3 men ride out of sight. When he turned and walked back to where she was standing, he stopped in front of her, and for a moment he simply looked at her with those gray eyes, and the expression in them was something she had not yet learned to name. "That was brave," he said, "and reckless." "Yes," she agreed, "mostly reckless." Something moved across his face. It was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one in the way that a shadow is adjacent to the thing that casts it. "You should have waited." "Perhaps," she said, "but I didn't." He looked at her for another moment, and then he said, "Are you all right?" She was startled by the question, by the particular quiet weight of it, by the way he asked it as though the answer genuinely mattered. "Yes," she said. "I'm fine, thank you." He nodded. He started to replace his hat, the small ritual of departure, and then he paused and said, without looking at her directly, "You handled yourself well." She stood in the dark street for a long time after he had walked back to his office, turning those words over, aware that from Oscar Kendrick, they constituted something very close to extraordinary. November brought colder nights, and a development that shifted the entire texture of life in Redemption Creek. A man named Virgil Coe arrived in town with 3 associates and took rooms at the Dusty Star, and within a week, it was understood by everyone who paid attention to these things that Virgil Coe was assessing the territory with an interest that was not commercial in any legitimate sense. Coe was perhaps 40, lean and well-dressed in the studied way of a man who wanted to appear prosperous, without appearing so prosperous as to attract the wrong kind of attention. He was polite to women and pleasant in public spaces, and had eyes that made Wilhelmina feel that he was always calculating the distance between himself and the nearest exit. She taught the Hargrove children and the Cooper children and the Briggs children and 6 others every weekday in the schoolhouse, and she heard things through those children that the children had heard through their parents, the way information moves in small communities, like water finding its level. She heard that Coe had been asking questions about the route the silver shipments took from the Alvarado mine south of town to the railroad depot at Las Cruces. She heard that Coe had been spending a great deal of time talking to Jonas Webb, who drove the shipment wagon and who had a weakness for the particular kind of friendly conversation that Coe apparently excelled at. She told Oscar this on a Wednesday evening in late November. She told him because it was information relevant to the safety of the town, and because she was a practical woman who understood the civic value of useful knowledge. She did not examine too closely her own awareness that she had been looking for a reason to speak with him. He was in his office, a spare and functional room that contained a desk, 2 chairs, a gun rack, a locked cabinet for the evidence he occasionally collected, and nothing that could be called decorative. He listened to her with the complete, focused attention he gave to everything, and when she had finished, he said, "How did you hear this?" "Danny Hargrove overheard his father talking to Jonas Webb at the store," she said. "Children are excellent listeners when adults forget they are present." He considered this. "You've been paying attention," he said. "I always pay attention," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I know," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made her understand he had been paying attention to her paying attention, and the thought of that did something complicated to her equilibrium. The Coe situation resolved itself 2 weeks later in a manner that required Oscar to ride south toward Las Cruces for 4 days with a deputy borrowed from the county seat. And when he returned, Coe and his associates were not with him, but their horses were, led behind his, and there was a locked strongbox on the saddle of one of those horses. And the next day, a telegram arrived from the county sheriff's office thanking Marshal Kendrick for his service to the territory. No one in Redemption Creek asked for the specific details, because everyone in Redemption Creek had already had experience with the specific shape of Oscar Kendrick's brief and efficient reports of his own activities. He came to her schoolhouse the evening he returned. She was alone, writing the next week's arithmetic problems on the board in careful chalk letters, the lantern burning yellow and warm against the dark outside. She heard the door open and turned, and he was standing in the doorframe with the cold night air at his back, his coat still dusty from the road. "I heard something while I was south," he said, "that I thought you should know." She put down the chalk. "Come in," she said. "You look cold." He came in, and he did look cold and tired, and like a man who had been in the saddle for days and was not going to mention it. He stood in the center of the schoolroom among the small desks and looked slightly too large for all of it and said, "One of Coe's men talked before we reached Las Cruces. He mentioned he had a contact here in town who'd been feeding him information about the shipment schedule." He paused. "He mentioned the contact was a woman." Wilhelmina stared at him. "You don't believe it was me?" It was not a question. She said it with the flat certainty of a woman who knew her own character and was not prepared to defend what did not require defense. Something shifted in his face, something that was very much like relief, swiftly masked. "No," he said, "I don't. But I need you to know that someone thought it worth saying, and that means there's a possibility of misunderstanding in town until it's cleared up." "Who was it?" she asked. "We don't yet know for certain. I have a suspicion." He looked at her carefully. "I wanted to tell you myself, so you weren't ambushed by it." She stood in the warm lantern light of the small schoolroom and looked at this man who had ridden hard for days and come here, before even going to his own house, to make sure she was not caught unaware. And she thought that perhaps the house with all its windows shut was not as sealed as it appeared. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded, as he always did when he did not have words ready for the situation, and then he said, "You should lock your door at night until this is resolved." "I always lock my door," she said. "Good." He turned toward the door and then, not turning back, he said, "I'm glad you're not the contact." "So am I," she said, and she heard the door close behind him, and she stood in the schoolroom for a long time after, listening to the wind in the scrub outside, thinking about the strange territory that lay between a man shutting himself up like a house in a storm, and a man riding through the dark to make sure you were not ambushed. December arrived in Redemption Creek with a severity that surprised Wilhelmina, who had expected desert temperatures, and discovered instead that New Mexico territory at 4,000 feet elevation in winter was a study in extremes. The days were bright and searingly cold, the nights were bitter, and the mountains to the east wore snow that threw back the sunlight with a blinding indifference. The schoolroom had a wood stove that she learned to manage with a competence she had not previously needed, and the children came each day wrapped in layers that made them look like small, determined bundles, and she taught them their letters and their numbers and their geography and their history. And on Friday afternoons, she let them read aloud from whatever books she had, which included 2 McGuffey readers, a battered copy of Robinson Crusoe, and a book of poetry that had been her mother's. She had been in Redemption Creek for 6 months, and she was surprised to discover that she did not miss Cincinnati as acutely as she had expected. She missed her sister. She wrote long letters to San Francisco that described the landscape in terms she knew Agnes would find outlandish. She missed proper music and a library. But the town had grown around her in ways she had not anticipated. The children had grown particular to her. Mabel Finch had become something close to a friend. And the landscape, which she had initially found merely austere, had revealed itself to be astonishing. And Oscar Kendrick had come to her schoolroom on a cold December evening to tell her that someone had tried to cast suspicion on her, because he did not want her to be ambushed by it. She thought about that constantly and reprimanded herself for thinking about it constantly, because she was a practical woman, and he was a man who had shut himself up tight after a loss so profound it had changed the shape of him, and she was only here temporarily, and she had a plan, which was to teach for 2 years, save enough to establish herself somewhere more permanent, and continue the life she had been methodically rebuilding since the February afternoon, when she had buried her second parent in the Cincinnati cold. The identity of Coe's contact was revealed in January, when it became clear through Oscar's investigation that the information had been coming from a woman named Ruth Pegler, who worked in the Dusty Star, and who had taken up with one of Coe's men under the impression that he intended to marry her and take her to California. Ruth Pegler was not prosecuted, partly because she had not known the full nature of what she was involved in, and partly because Oscar Kendrick was not a man who dealt harshly with people who had been deceived. The town's reaction was complicated and not uniformly kind, and Wilhelmina found herself in several heated conversations in Mabel Finch's kitchen about the nature of judgment and the specific cruelties that loneliness can drive a person toward. Oscar, who was present at one of these kitchen conversations, said very little, but on his way out he said quietly to Wilhelmina, "You argued well for her." "Someone needed to," she said. He looked at her with that gray regard that she had come to understand was not coldness but a very deep quality of attention. "Yes," he said, "someone needed to." February was when the letters from her sister began to change their tone. Agnes wrote from San Francisco with increasing urgency, describing the opportunities there, the teaching positions available, the society, the proximity to family. Agnes was not subtle, and her letters were not subtle, and between every line Wilhelmina could read the unspoken concern of a surviving sibling watching her only remaining family disappear into the desert. "Come west," Agnes wrote. "Come proper west, where there are proper people and proper streets and you can have a proper life again." Wilhelmina read these letters in her room above the Finch store, and thought about what a proper life meant, and whether it was the same thing as a full one. She wrote back carefully, with the specific evasions of a woman who was not ready to examine too closely what she was staying for. She said the children needed her. She said the term was not finished. She said there was a dance coming up for the spring festival that she had helped organize. That last thing was true. The Redemption Creek Spring Festival was a tradition, held in the Hargrove barn on the last Saturday of March, and it involved a fiddle player and a caller and enough food to stagger a mule. And it was one of the events that the town used to remind itself that it was a community, and not merely a collection of people who had ended up in the same place by accident. She had volunteered to help organize it because Mabel Finch had asked her, and because she was genuinely fond of organizing things, and because she admitted to herself in the privacy of late-night honesty, looking for something to occupy her attention in a way that required her full presence. Oscar did not come to town meetings about the festival. He did not involve himself in social planning. But he appeared briefly at the Finch store one afternoon when she was discussing the arrangement of tables with Mabel, and he stood in the doorway and listened for a moment, and she caught his eye, and he said, "I'll handle the torches along the road to the Hargrove place. People need to be able to find it after dark." It was the most he had ever volunteered for a social occasion. She thanked him with the precise gravity the offer seemed to require, and he nodded and left, and Mabel Finch said nothing at all, which was louder than most speeches. March arrived. The cold broke. The scrub on the hillsides produced small yellow flowers that surprised Wilhelmina every morning with their determination. The creek ran loud and cold with snowmelt from the mountains. The children were restless in the way that children become restless in spring, and she let them spend the last period of Friday afternoons outside, learning the names of plants and rocks, because the territory was its own curriculum if you were willing to let it teach. She made a decision in the second week of March. She wrote to Agnes and said she would come to San Francisco in June, when the school term ended. She would come and stay through the summer and reassess. She would see whether the proper life Agnes described felt like something she wanted to fit herself back into. She posted the letter on a Tuesday morning and felt the specific relief of a decision made, and also the specific hollow feeling that comes with it. And she did not look too directly at the source of the hollow feeling because she was a practical woman and some examinations were not useful. She told Mabel Finch she was leaving at the end of term. Mabel said nothing for a long moment, and then she said, "Does Oscar know?" Wilhelmina looked at her. "Why would Marshal Kendrick need to know?" she asked. Mabel Finch had many qualities, and one of them was the ability to convey an enormous amount of information with an expression alone. She employed this ability now. Then she said, "He doesn't then," and turned back to her work, and the subject was apparently closed. She did not tell Oscar. There was no particular reason to tell Oscar. He was the marshal. She was the schoolteacher. They spoke when they encountered each other, which was frequently, and they had had a number of conversations over the 9 months she had lived here that she valued as some of the best conversations she had ever had. Conversations about justice, and about children, and about the land, and about what people owed each other in remote places. But she did not tell him she was leaving, because doing so would have required her to understand why his knowing felt like it mattered. The festival was set for Saturday, the 29th of March. The week before it, Oscar came to her schoolroom on a Thursday evening again, as he had done perhaps 6 or 8 times over the 9 months, always with something specific to report or discuss. She had come to recognize the particular knock, 3 times deliberate, and the particular way he stood when she opened the door, not quite at ease but not quite formal either, somewhere in the space between. This evening he came with news about a ranching family south of town, the Alvarez family, whose land had been subject to a boundary dispute with a recently arrived speculator from back east, a man named Driscoll who had purchased what he claimed were valid deed rights to the southern section. Oscar had been investigating the dispute for 2 weeks, and his news was that the original deed had been fraudulently altered before Driscoll bought it, which meant the Alvarez family's claim was valid, and Driscoll's was not. He explained all of this with his usual economy of words, and Wilhelmina listened, and when he finished she said, "The Alvarez family has been here for 40 years. Their grandfather came with the first Spanish land grant," Oscar confirmed, "and Driscoll is from Philadelphia." "He is." She looked at him. "What happens now?" "It goes to the territorial court at Albuquerque. I've sent the evidence and my report." He paused. "They'll likely rule for the Alvarez family. The fraud is clear." "Likely," she said, with a particular emphasis on the word. "Courts are imperfect instruments," he said, "but they're what we have." She thought about this. She thought about the Alvarez family, a mother and 3 grown sons and 2 daughters-in-law, and a collection of grandchildren who were among her students, working that land with the specific devotion of people who understood that they were not just farming soil, but maintaining a continuity that stretched back further than most of the people around them could comfortably imagine. She thought about what it meant to have someone in your corner who would spend 2 weeks investigating a land fraud because it was the right thing to do. "You spent 2 weeks on this," she said. "Yes. Your jurisdiction is criminal law. Fraud is criminal." She looked at him. He looked back. Outside, the wind was doing its evening work in the scrub, that dry whispering that she had come to find oddly soothing in the months she had been here. "You didn't have to take this on," she said. "No," he agreed. "I didn't have to." Something hung in the space between that statement and whatever came next, a space that felt denser than air should be, freighted with all the things that had been building in the margins of 9 months of careful, bounded conversations. She thought about saying something. She thought about opening a window in that well-sealed house. Then she thought about her letter to Agnes, already in the mail, already traveling west, and she let the moment pass. "I hope the court rules correctly," she said. "So do I," he said. And then he said good night, and she heard the door close, and she sat in the schoolroom with her chalk in her hand and felt the hollow feeling expand until it occupied the whole of her chest. The night of the spring festival, the 29th of March, 1884, the Hargrove barn was warm and bright with lantern light, and the torches along the road burned exactly as Oscar had promised they would. The fiddle player, Pete Marsh, had brought a friend with a guitar, and the 2 of them set up a sound that filled the barn and bounced off the rafters and made even the most reticent feet in Redemption Creek want to move. Wilhelmina wore her best dress, the dark green wool she had brought from Cincinnati, which she had altered in November to fit better in the bodice, and which she had spent an hour pressing that afternoon. She had put her hair up with more care than usual, and then felt slightly ridiculous about having done so, and taken it down and put it back up again in what she told herself was a more practical arrangement. She danced with Harold Finch, and she danced with Reverend Hollies, who danced with surprising vigor for a man of the cloth, and she danced with young Danny Hargrove, who was 14 and betread with the effort of getting through a reel without stepping on her feet, which he almost managed. She ate Mabel Finch's apple cake and talked to the Alvarez family, who had come to the festival with the particular joy of people celebrating a recent legal victory, the territorial court having ruled in their favor the previous week. She watched the children run between adult legs and felt the warm, inclusive happiness of a community doing what communities do best, which is simply being together. She watched the door for Oscar Kendrick and told herself she was not watching for him. He came in at 8:30, after she had stopped watching for him, which was perhaps why she did not see him enter. She became aware of him because the quality of the air near her changed, the specific stillness that surrounded him imposing itself on the warm, moving air of the barn the way a stone imposes itself on running water, creating its own current. He was in his good coat, the dark wool one she had seen him wear to church, and he had his hat in his hands rather than on his head, which was a concession to the indoor space that she found oddly touching. He stood near the wall, as he always did in public gatherings, and he looked across the room, and when his gaze reached her, it stopped. They did not speak for the first 20 minutes. He stayed near his wall. She stayed in the center of the gathering. But she was aware of him the way you are aware of a fire in a room, not looking at it directly but never entirely free of the knowledge of its presence and its heat. It was Mabel Finch who closed the gap, which Wilhelmina later decided was entirely intentional. Mabel sailed past her with a plate of cornbread and said, almost in passing, "Oscar's over there all by himself looking like a man who needs someone to talk to." And then she was gone before Wilhelmina could respond, and Wilhelmina stood holding a cup of cider and considered her options. She walked to where he was standing. "Marshal Kendrick," she said. "Miss Hale." He had been watching the dancing with an expression that she could not quite read. He turned it toward her now. "Are you going to dance?" she asked. "I don't generally dance," he said. "That's not what I asked," she said. A long pause. "No," he said, "I'm not going to dance." "That's a shame," she said. "Pete Marsh is very good." He looked at her with the gray eyes that always seemed to be taking inventory of the most important things. "Yes," he said, "he is." They stood together at the wall and listened to Pete Marsh and his friend play a slow tune that was not quite a waltz and not quite a reel but something in between, something that pulled at the feet and the chest in equal measure. The barn was warm. The lanterns threw a gold that made everything look like a memory of itself, already nostalgic even while it was happening. "I'm leaving at the end of term," she said. She had not planned to say it. She felt the words leave her mouth and could not entirely account for where they had come from, except that the warm light and the music and his particular quality of presence had apparently dissolved whatever editorial function usually governed her speech. He went very still. He was already a still man, but this was a different quality of stillness, the kind that happens when something unexpected strikes a surface that seemed solid. "San Francisco," he said. It was not quite a question. "My sister is there. She's been asking me to come." She looked at her cider. "And the position here is only contracted through June, and the council hasn't discussed renewal yet, and I have to think about what comes next." "Yes," he said. The word was entirely neutral and communicated nothing at all, which was somehow worse than if he had communicated something. "I've enjoyed being here," she said, and that was also more honest than she had intended. He looked at the dancers. "Redemption Creek has been glad to have you," he said, in the official tone of a civic representative, and she felt something in her chest twist like a wrung cloth. "That's very diplomatic," she said. Another pause, a long one, filled with fiddle music and the stamping of feet. Then he said, quietly, without the diplomatic distance, "I've been glad to have you." She turned to look at him. He was still looking at the dancers, but the line of his jaw was tense in a way she recognized, as emotion pressed very hard against its containment. "Oscar," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it in the warm barn made something shift between them as definitively as a door swinging on its hinges. He turned and looked at her, and there was the thing she had been watching for without letting herself name it, the thing she had been circling for 9 months, in his eyes clear and unmistakable. But whatever he might have said was interrupted by a commotion near the barn door, where Jonah's Webb had apparently decided that the festival was an appropriate occasion to settle a month-old grievance with Hector Briggs about a fence line, and the two men were shouting in a way that threatened to escalate past shouting. Oscar's head turned with the automatic attention of a man whose profession meant that disturbances were always his to manage, and he put his hat on and crossed the floor with that unhurried stride, and she watched him insert himself between the two shouting men with the effortless authority of someone who simply assumed that the situation would resolve itself in his direction, which it did. By the time he had extracted Jonah's Webb from the situation and walked him outside for a conversation that evidently concluded the matter, Pete Marsh had switched to a new tune, and Mabel Finch had caught Wilhelmina's elbow and pulled her into a reel with Harold and 2 of the Alvarez boys, and the evening had moved on in the way that evenings move on, carrying their opportunities with them. She stayed until the band began to play the final songs of the evening, the slowdown music that signaled that the night was making its way toward midnight, and people with early morning chores were beginning to think about coats and lanterns and the ride home. She had her carpet bag, which she had brought because her room above the store was cold at night, and she had intended to take her heavy shawl with her to the festival. She had already said her goodbyes to the Finch family and little Bessie Cooper, who had wept slightly at the news of her departure, and she had shaken hands with Reverend Hollis, who had said she would be greatly missed. She was at the barn door, the bag in her hands, the cold night air coming through the opening where someone had propped it slightly ajar, thinking about the morning stage at 7 that would take her to the rail connection at Las Cruces and from there to the west, to Agnes in San Francisco and the proper life. And the fiddle stopped mid-note, and Oscar Kendrick stepped out of the crowd. Now she stood with her carpetbag set down on the floor of the Hargrove barn, in the warm lantern light. Among the waiting faces of everyone who lived in this town she had arrived in 9 months ago thinking it was a temporary stop, and Oscar Kendrick stood 2 feet in front of her with his hat in his hands again, and Pete Marsh had his bow poised, waiting. "One more song," Oscar said again, quieter this time, just for her, not for the room. "You owe me nothing and I know that, but one more song is all I need." "To say what?" she asked. Her voice was very low. He looked at her with all his windows open, every one of them, and the light inside was visible for the first time, and it was considerable. "That I should have said something before now," he said. "That I have been standing near you for 9 months and choosing silence because I was afraid, and that is not a reason I'm proud of." He paused. "That this town is a different place than it was before you came to it. That I am a different person." Another pause, the words coming with the careful deliberateness of a man who has never said them before, and is saying them now because the alternative is watching a stage carry them away forever. "That I don't want you to get on the stage at 7. The barn was absolutely silent. Wilhelmina was aware of Mabel Finch somewhere behind her, and Reverend Hollis, and the Alvarez family, and the Cooper family, and Danny Hargrove, who would tell this story for the rest of his life. She was aware of the cold air from the slightly open door and the warm lantern light, and the weight of her carpetbag on the floor and the ticket in her corset. She was aware that Oscar Kendrick was looking at her with the full force of everything he had kept sealed for 4 years, and that it was not a small thing what was inside him. It was not a small thing at all. "You said one song," she said. "You haven't played it yet." His breath released in something that was very nearly a laugh, and the tension in the barn broke like a fever, and Pete Marsh drew his bow across the strings and began to play, and it was a slow song, the kind that 2 people can only really dance to together, and Oscar Kendrick held out his hand. She took it. He was not, as he had said, a man who generally danced. He was careful and a little stiff at first, the way a man is careful when he is doing something that matters very much and he does not want to do it wrong. But the song was slow and Pete Marsh was good, and the lantern light was warm, and she was close enough to feel the solid reality of him, and after the first few measures the careful stiffness loosened into something else, something that was simply the 2 of them moving together in the same rhythm for the first time in 9 months of careful, bounded orbiting. "I'm afraid," he said, low enough that only she could hear it. "So am I," she said. "I don't mean of dancing. I know what you mean." He was quiet for a measure, too, the music moving around them. "Clara was 4 years ago," he said, with the particular difficulty of a man bringing something into light that has lived in the dark. "I know that sounds like an explanation. It isn't, it's just where I've been." "I know where you've been," she said. "I've been watching you be there." He pulled back slightly to look at her face. And it's very far away," she said, "but I've been watching you come back from it, a little at a time all year." Something moved through his face, complicated and deep. "Mina," he said, and it was the first time anyone in Redemption Creek had shortened her name, and from him it sounded like the most private thing imaginable. "Don't call me Mina," she said automatically. "Why not?" Because my mother called me Mina and it makes me feel like crying, and I am not going to cry at a barn dance, Oscar Kendrick. And then he smiled. A real one, full and open, nothing reserved about it, and it was the most devastating thing she had ever seen on a human face, because she understood immediately that she had never seen it before, not fully, and that it had been there all along waiting for a reason to surface, and that she was the reason, and the hollow feeling in her chest filled in like water finding its level. The song was ending. She could feel it in Pete Marsh's phrasing, the way the notes were winding toward resolution. She thought about the ticket in her corset. She thought about Agnes in San Francisco, expecting her in June. She thought about the children in the schoolhouse, and the yellow flowers on the hillsides and the creek that ran loud in spring. She thought about a man who had ridden through the dark to warn her, who had spent 2 weeks on a land fraud because it was right, who had come to her schoolroom 6 or 8 times over 9 months with specific and useful information, and never once, in all of that, said the thing that was apparently living behind all of it. The stage at 7, she said. Yes, he said, if I'm not on it. Yes. What happens then? He looked at her, those gray eyes steady and serious and entirely open. I would very much like to take you to dinner, he said. At the Finch table if Mabel will have us, tomorrow, at noon. She almost laughed at the specificity of it, at the careful practicality of this man who could not say everything at once but could say one true and honest thing, which was that he wanted to take her to dinner at noon tomorrow. That seems like a very modest beginning, she said. I'm a modest man, he said. You are absolutely not a modest man, she said. The smile again, briefer this time but no less devastating. No, he agreed, I'm not. Pete Marsh played the last note and let it sustain, and then it was over and the barn came back to life around them, people moving and talking, the deliberate resumption of normalcy that people produce when they have just witnessed something they want to give privacy to. Wilhelmina and Oscar stood still in the center of it for a moment, his hand still holding hers. Well, she said. Well, he said. She looked at the carpet bag on the floor. She looked at the barn door and the darkness beyond it and thought about the stage at 7 and the ticket and Agnes and San Francisco. She looked at Oscar Kendrick. I will need to write a very difficult letter to my sister, she said. He was quiet for a moment and then he said very carefully, I expect you will. She will not be pleased. No, she may come here to retrieve me personally. She's welcome, he said. I'll try to convince her the territory has its merits. She's from Cincinnati, Wilhelmina said. She has strong opinions about civilization. So do I, he said. We'll disagree respectfully. She picked up her carpet bag. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of everything it contained, the ticket, the intentions, the plan she had built to protect herself while she decided what came next. Then she said, I'll see you at noon tomorrow then. At noon, he said. Yes. She walked to the barn door and then stopped and looked back at him, standing in the lantern light among the Hargrove family and the Finch family and the Cooper family, and all the rest of the people who made up this town she had arrived in thinking she was passing through. The torches along the road are very well placed, she said. Thank you for that. His face did something small and contained and enormously warm. Thank you for noticing, he said. She walked out into the cold March night, under a sky full of stars that she had learned the names of over the past 9 months from an astronomy book she had ordered from the Albuquerque catalog, and she thought that she would not, in fact, be on the stage at 7, and that she had some very significant letters to write, and that the territory had a quality at midnight that she had come to love without quite realizing she had done so. The following months were not simple. Very little that matters is simple. Wilhelmina wrote to Agnes, a long and careful letter that took 3 drafts and still did not adequately explain the specific gravity of Oscar Kendrick, the way he occupied space, and the particular quality of his attention, and the fact that she had chosen to stay in a desert territory in New Mexico and was happier than she had been since before her parents died. Agnes wrote back with the vigor of a concerned older sister, which was to say with considerable detailed argument, and a promise to come and see for herself what on earth was going on. Wilhelmina negotiated her contract renewal with the town council for another full year and received a small increase in her salary that she suspected Oscar had something to do with, though when she raised this with him, he produced an expression of such absolute neutrality that she was unable to prove it. The dinner at noon at the Finch table became a regular event, Mabel's contribution to the proceedings being to provide excellent food and then find urgent business elsewhere in the store, a strategy of transparency so obvious that Harold Finch eventually stopped pretending to be surprised by it. These dinners were long and wide-ranging, covering territories that neither of them had explored with another person in years. Oscar talked about Missouri and about what the war had done to the landscape and the people, and about the specific way he had come west with no particular destination in mind and found Redemption Creek, which had needed a marshal, and discovered that the work suited him. He talked about Clara with a careful, honest grief that made it clear he had loved her genuinely, and that her loss had been a wound that ran very deep, and Wilhelmina listened with the whole of her attention and did not flinch from it, because it was part of him, and she was not interested in selective acceptance. She talked about her parents and about the schoolroom in Cincinnati, and about the specific loneliness of a woman who is competent and educated, and has narrowed her future down to a series of practical decisions, because the romantic ones feel too dangerous to make without people to come home to. She talked about Agnes with the complicated love of sisters who are very different from each other and bound absolutely by blood and history. She talked about what she had thought the territory would be and what it had turned out to be, which were almost entirely different things, and better. In April, on a Sunday afternoon, Oscar took her riding on the ridge road above the town. He had a good bay horse named Calhoun, and he arranged a calm and reliable sorrel mare from the livery stable for Wilhelmina, who had ridden in Cincinnati but not with any particular frequency, and the two of them rode up the ridge road as the afternoon sun moved west and the whole valley lay below them, the town small and precise, and the creek a silver line through the scrub, and she thought that she had never in her life seen anything quite as beautiful, and she was not thinking only about the view. He kissed her for the first time on that ridge, not dramatically, not with the elaborate framing of a man performing a romantic gesture, but with the quiet and deliberate attention he gave to all important things, a kiss that was brief and serious, and contained a great deal of what he found difficult to say in words. She thought afterward that it was exactly the kind of kiss she would have expected from him, which was to say that it felt entirely like him and unlike anything else. "I should have done that months ago," he said. "Yes," she agreed, "you should have." "In my defense," he said, "I was working through some things." "I know," she said, "I was watching." He looked at her with that gray gaze that she had come to understand was the most intimate thing about him, the way he looked at the things he valued with a focus so complete it was almost tactile. "What did you see?" he asked. "A man learning how to come back to himself," she said, "and I thought it would be rude to interrupt." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her, at the valley below, at the mountains still holding their snow on the eastern horizon. "Thank you," he said, "for waiting." "I didn't decide to wait," she said. "I just didn't leave. Until you were going to." "Until I was going to," she agreed. Agnes arrived in May, unannounced, on the Tuesday stage, with 2 large bags and the expression of a woman who had made up her mind about something before she arrived, and was prepared to maintain her position under any circumstances. She was 4 years older than Wilhelmina, dark-haired and opinionated and funny, in the specific way of people who have decided that if the world is going to be difficult, they might as well find it amusing. She looked at Redemption Creek with the eye of a woman from San Francisco, which was to say she found it small and dry and lacking in adequate coffee, and she said so with the comfortable frankness of a sister who knows she is loved regardless. She met Oscar on her second day in town, at dinner at the Finch table, which had become something of a neutral ground for significant events in the lives of everyone in Redemption Creek. Wilhelmina watched the meeting with the specific anxiety of a person who has two people they love very much and is not entirely certain they will like each other. She need not have worried, or not exactly. Agnes and Oscar did not like each other immediately, because Agnes tested people as a matter of principle, and Oscar did not perform warmth on demand. But they recognized each other, which was perhaps more important. Agnes was sharp and direct and did not tolerate evasion, and Oscar, whatever his faults, was not an evasive man. When Agnes asked him, quite bluntly over Mabel's roast chicken, what exactly his intentions were toward her sister, Oscar answered her with a directness that matched her own. "I intend to ask her to marry me," he said, "when I'm confident she has chosen this territory freely and not because of me." Agnes looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "She has chosen it. I can tell she looks different than she did before she came here." A pause. "She looks like herself." Oscar looked at Wilhelmina, and Wilhelmina felt warmth climb her face in a way she had not experienced since she was 15. "Yes," Oscar said quietly. "She does." Agnes stayed for 2 weeks and revised her position on Redemption Creek from dismissive to grudgingly approving to something closer to genuine fondness by the time the stage came to take her back to Las Cruces and the Rail West. She took Mabel Finch aside on her last morning and said something that made Mabel nod with the satisfied expression of a woman who has been right about something for some time. She hugged Wilhelmina for a long time at the stage stop and whispered, "He watches you like you're the most important thing in his field of vision." And Wilhelmina said, "Agnes," in the tone that means please stop, and Agnes said, "I am just observing facts." And then she was on the stage and it pulled away, and Wilhelmina stood in the dust of its going with the odd lightness of a sister's approval received. She did not have long to wait. On a Saturday evening in late May, Oscar appeared at her door above the Finch store at an hour that was neither the morning hour of his rounds nor the evening hour of his occasional visits, but an intermediate hour that suggested specific intent. He was in his good coat and he was not wearing his hat, which was unusual enough outdoors that she noticed it immediately. He asked her to walk with him. They walked to the edge of town, where the main street ended, and the road became a track leading up toward the ridge, in the long evening light of late spring that made everything in the territory glow in shades of copper and gold. He did not speak for some distance, and she matched his silence because she had learned that his silences were not empty. He stopped where the track curved and the town was visible below them, the stone buildings and the wooden ones and the steeple of Reverend Hollis's church, and the torch posts along the road to the Hargrove place, and the creek glittering in the evening light. He turned and looked at her. He had the particular expression of a man who has prepared what he wants to say and is discovering in the moment that preparation is inadequate. "I want to tell you something," he said, "that I should have been better at saying from the beginning." "All right," she said. "I know that I am not easy," he said. "I know that I am quiet in ways that can feel like distance, and that I don't move quickly toward the things I want, and that this has cost both of us time this year that I regret." He stopped. "But I also know that what I feel for you is the most honest thing I have felt in a very long time, and I don't want to let another day pass without asking you whether you would be willing to build something here with me." She looked at him in the copper light. "That's the longest speech I've ever heard you make," she said. A flicker of something that might have been nerves crossed his face. "I practiced it," he said. "Did you?" "Several times." She stepped toward him and took his hand and looked up at him in the evening light of Redemption Creek, New Mexico Territory in the year 1884. "Yes," she said, "I would be willing." He produced something from the pocket of his good coat. It was a ring, simple and plain, a gold band with a small turquoise stone that was as much of the territory as it was possible to put on a person's finger. And she understood that he had thought about what she was and where she had come to and had chosen accordingly. And she felt the understanding of it go through her like light through a clean pane of glass. He slid it onto her finger. "I am going to try to be better at saying the things that matter," he said. "So am I," she said. "We'll both be better at it." He looked at the ring on her hand and then at her face with the full and open attention that was the most private and precious thing about him. "Wilhelmina Hale," he said, "you are the most surprising thing that has ever happened to me." "You are not what I expected the West to be," she told him. "You are considerably better." He kissed her in the copper evening light above the town, and this time it was not brief. They were married in September, in Reverend Hollis's church, which was packed to its modest walls with every person in Redemption Creek and several from the ranches outside it. Agnes came from San Francisco for the occasion and cried in a way that she would later strenuously deny. Mabel Finch managed the reception with the efficiency of a general, and the food was extraordinary, and Pete Marsh played, and the evening extended past midnight into the warm September dark with the particular generosity of a celebration that a whole community has decided to throw its heart into. Wilhelmina moved from the room above the Finch store into the small stone house behind the marshal's office, which she discovered was not as Spartan inside as its exterior suggested. Oscar had spent the August weeks before the wedding buying furniture and a proper kitchen stove from the Albuquerque catalog, and she found, on the morning after their wedding when she looked around the space with the specific attention of someone making it home, that he had thought carefully about what she would need and what she would want, and had tried to provide both. She kept her teaching position. The town council was unanimous on this point, partly because the children of Redemption Creek would have produced a civic rebellion if the new schoolteacher had been removed, and partly because the council had come to understand that Wilhelmina Hale, now Wilhelmina Kendrick, was a permanent and valuable feature of the town's life. Oscar went about his work as he always had, methodical and thorough and alone in the field, though the meaning of alone had shifted, because he came home now, every evening, to a lamp lit in the window of the stone house, and the sound of someone else in the kitchen, and the specific comfort of being known by another person in the intimate daily ways that constitute a shared life. Wilhelmina would hear his boots on the step and know the weight of his day by the cadence of them, heavy when something had gone wrong or light when it had gone well, and she would have coffee ready either way because she was a practical woman and coffee was always an appropriate response. In the spring of 1885, she told him about the baby. He was at the kitchen table with his coffee, reading the weekly newspaper that came from Albuquerque 2 days late, and she sat down across from him and said, "I need to tell you something," in the tone that meant it was important, and he set down the paper and gave her his full and unhurried attention, as he always did when she used that tone. She told him. He sat very still for a moment, in the particular way he had of absorbing important information before responding to it, and she watched his face go through something she had never seen on it before, something that was surprise and then a particular quality of joy, not the quick bright joy of an unexpected pleasure, but a deeper thing, slower and more serious, the joy of a man who had not expected to have this and understood what it was worth. He stood and came around the table and took her hands and said nothing for a long moment, just held her hands and looked at her, and then he said, "Are you well?" "Very well," she said. "Good," he said. And then with the careful honesty that was his best quality, I am very glad," he paused. "I was not certain I would be a father again." She looked up at him. This was new. "Again," she said, a pause. "Clara lost a baby in our second year," he said with the particular quietness of a long-held private grief. "She was not well after, and then she was gone before we could try again." He looked at her steadily. "I am telling you this because it is part of my history and I do not want to keep things from you." She held his hands tighter. "Thank you for telling me. I will be careful," he said. "With you, with both of you." It was not a small statement. She understood the full weight of it. "I know you will," she said. In October of 1885, their son was born. Doc Emmett Sayers attended, and Mabel Finch was present in the way that Mabel Finch was present for most significant events in Redemption Creek, which was to say she was entirely necessary. The birth was not easy, as first births frequently are not, and Oscar spent 6 hours in the front room of the stone house in a state of controlled anxiety that Mabel described to Agnes in a letter as the most still and frightened she had ever seen a man who was not in actual danger. When Doc Sayers came to tell him it was over and he could come in, Oscar walked through the door with the deliberate step of a man approaching something very important, and Wilhelmina, exhausted and triumphant in equal measure, held up the small red-faced person who was their son, and watched Oscar Kendrick, who had faced the Delgado brothers and Virgil Coe and land fraud and the deep solitary grief of 4 years alone, sit carefully on the edge of the bed and take his son in his hands with a tenderness so complete it was almost audible. They named him Thomas, after Wilhelmina's father. Oscar did not demur about this, which told her everything she needed to know about the man she had married. Thomas grew with the accelerated velocity of healthy children, and by his first birthday, he was walking with the unsteady confidence of someone who has recently discovered ambulation and intends to employ it everywhere simultaneously. He had his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair, and a particular quality of focused attention, when something interested him, that made Mabel Finch say he was exactly like both his parents at once and would either be a marshal or a schoolteacher. Agnes came to visit that first Christmas, and the second one, and the third, and somewhere in the third visit she began to talk less about the superiority of San Francisco and more about the particular quality of life in Redemption Creek. And on her fourth visit she arrived with 2 bags and a man named Gerald Whitmore, who had a furniture-making business in Albuquerque, and the slightly defiant expression of a woman announcing a decision she has already made. "He's going to open a shop here," Agnes said, as though this was a perfectly unremarkable piece of information. "In Redemption Creek," Wilhelmina said. "The town is growing," Agnes said. "Gerald says there's an excellent market for good furniture west of the Rio Grande." She looked at her sister. "Don't say anything." "I wasn't going to say anything," Wilhelmina said. "I was going to say welcome." Agnes blinked. Then she smiled, the full version, the one that was usually reserved for moments she did not expect. "All right then," she said. Oscar shook Gerald Whitmore's hand with the focused assessment of a man who was evaluating a new member of something that mattered to him. And Gerald, who was a steady, good-humored man with a craftsman's hands and a tendency to measure things before he cut them, met the assessment directly and passed it. Oscar told Wilhelmina afterward that he thought Gerald was a good man, which was the entirety of his expressed opinion, and Wilhelmina, who had learned to parse his economies, understood this as high praise. Gerald Whitmore opened his furniture shop on the south end of Main Street in the spring of 1887, and Agnes helped him manage the books, because she was excellent with numbers and had been keeping her own accounts for years. They married that summer in the same church where Oscar and Wilhelmina had married, with Reverend Hollies presiding and Pete Marsh playing and Mabel Finch managing the food with the same general authority. The town of Redemption Creek had grown by that year. There was a second saloon that was better behaved than the Dusty Star. There was a small hotel. There was a telegraph office that had opened in 1886, which made Oscar's work easier in specific ways and more complicated in others, because the connectivity that improved law enforcement also improved the mobility of people who made law enforcement necessary. There was talk of a rail spur that would eventually connect the town more directly to the main line, a prospect that divided opinion sharply between those who saw it as progress and those who understood that progress in the territory was a thing with 2 edges. Wilhelmina's schoolhouse expanded in 1887, a second room added to accommodate the growing enrollment, and she hired an assistant teacher, a young woman named Frances Ortega from a family that had been in the territory for 3 generations, and who spoke both English and Spanish with equal facility. which was something Wilhelmina had been trying to achieve in her own instruction with considerable effort and modest success. Frances was an excellent teacher, and the two women developed a partnership that made the Redemption Creek School one of the better educational institutions in that part of the territory. Oscar's work during these years was not without its dangerous moments. The territory in the 1880s was still in the process of resolving conflicts that had been accumulating for decades, disputes over land and water, and cattle that sometimes reached the point where a marshal's word was not sufficient, and the county had to send additional help. He was shot in the shoulder in the winter of 1886, a graze from a distance during an altercation with a cattle thief that was more serious than the word graze suggested, but less serious than the 2 nights Wilhelmina spent in the kind of alert and contained fear she recognized as the specific cost of loving a person who walks into dangerous situations, because that is what his work requires. He recovered fully. He was not, she learned over these years, a man who invited danger carelessly or courted it through some misplaced notion of bravado. He was a man who understood risk clearly and accepted it as the cost of a work he believed in, which is a different thing, and she was proud of him for it even when it frightened her. She told him so when he was recovered from the shoulder wound, and she had carried the fear long enough that it needed to be spoken. She told him she was proud of him and she was afraid sometimes, and she needed him to understand that both of those things were true simultaneously. He looked at her with the full weight of his attention and said, "I know. And I need you to understand that I am more careful than I would have been before, because of what I would leave behind if I wasn't." She held that for a moment, the specific gravity of it. "Good," she said. "Stay careful." "I intend to," he said. And then, with the quiet humor that had emerged in him over their years together, humor that had been there all along waiting for the right conditions, "I have a son who is going to need someone to ride with him when he's old enough, and I intend to be here for it." Thomas was 3 by then, already showing the focused curiosity of a child who intended to understand everything in his field of vision before he was 5. He had discovered horses with the particular passion of a child raised near a livery stable, and Oscar had begun spending Sunday afternoons teaching him the proper way to approach an animal, with patience and with respect, beginning the long education that would eventually include riding and the names of stars and the principles of law as Oscar understood them, which were not abstract principles but living ones, practiced daily on the ground of a specific place among specific people. In 1888, Wilhelmina told Oscar about their second child. This time he was in the front room of the stone house when she told him, and Thomas was asleep in the back, and the lamp was burning low, and he received the news with the same deep quality of joy as the first time, but without any of the previous surprise, just the pure warm weight of it. "A brother for Thomas," he said. "Or a sister," she said. "Or a sister," he agreed, with the openness of a man who had learned not to fix the future into a predetermined shape. Their second child was born in the late summer of 1888, on an August night when the monsoon rain was hammering the iron roof of the stone house with the magnificent indifference of desert weather. It was a boy. They named him Samuel, after Oscar's father, which made Oscar very quiet for a moment, and then very present in the way he got when something moved him genuinely. Thomas, at nearly 3, received Samuel with the complicated ambivalence of a firstborn displaced from singular attention, and Oscar handled this with the instinctive understanding of a man who had thought carefully about what children need, which is mostly honesty and consistency, and the repeated demonstration that love is not a finite resource that gets divided but an expanding thing. The school year of 1888 to 1889 was Wilhelmina's 6th in Redemption Creek, and she marked it privately as a kind of anniversary not of her arrival but of her staying. That specific moment at the barn dance when she had set down her carpetbag and made a choice that had produced, by now, a house and a husband and 2 sons and a sister living down the street, and a schoolroom full of children she had helped to shape. She thought sometimes about the woman who had stepped off the stage in June of 1883 with a schoolteacher's certificate and a plan, a practical, temporary plan for getting through the next period of her life before the real life resumed. She thought about what that woman had not known and what she would have told her. She thought she would have told her, "Stay. It's better than you think it's going to be." Oscar turned 40 in the spring of 1889, and the town arranged a gathering at the Hargrove barn for the occasion that he did not ask for and could not prevent, because Mabel Finch organized it with the unstoppable momentum of a woman who has decided something is going to happen. He stood in the warm barn surrounded by the people who had been his town for 15 years and accepted their affection with the grace of a man who has learned, slowly and at cost, how to receive it without flinching. Thomas stood next to his father at the gathering with the fierce and watchful pride of a child who understood on some pre-verbal level that his father was important here. Samuel, not yet a year old, was in Wilhelmina's arms, and she looked across the barn at Oscar standing with his son beside him and thought about a fiddle stopping mid-note on a March evening, and a man crossing a barn floor with his hat in his hands and 6 words that had changed everything. "One more song. That is all I need." She had given him considerably more than one song. She thought about that now, about how the specific and particular thing he had asked for, not a grand declaration, not a sweeping gesture, but one song, had been entirely true to who he was, a man who moved by increments toward the things he wanted, who did not ask for more than he could justify in the moment, who had learned to lead with practicality because the grand gestures of his interior life were too large and too important to risk making wrong. She crossed the barn to where he was standing, Thomas still at his side, and she stood next to him, and he put his hand at the small of her back with the ease and naturalness of a man touching the most familiar thing he knows. And Thomas tugged at his father's coat sleeve to show him something, and Samuel made a satisfied sound in her arms, and Pete Marsh was playing in the corner of the barn, and the lanterns were the same as they had always been, gold and warm, and Redemption Creek was outside the walls, doing what it did, and the year was 1889, and the territory was on its way to becoming a state, slowly and in the incremental manner of all important things. "Are you happy?" she said. He looked at her, gray eyes open, nothing reserved. "Yes," he said. "Are you?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, the way she considered all important things. She thought about Cincinnati and Agnes and the practical plan and the temporary stop that was now permanent. She thought about yellow flowers on spring hillsides and a creek running loud with snowmelt and a stone house with a lamp in the window and a man who had come home to it every evening for 5 years. She thought about Thomas's gray eyes and Samuel's dark hair and a turquoise ring on her finger that was as much of this land as it was possible to carry on a person. "Yes," she said, "I am." He took her hand, the one with the ring, and held it in the warm barn light, and Pete Marsh played, and the people of Redemption Creek moved around them with the easy familiarity of a life shared in close quarters and understood, and the night went on in the way that good nights go on, slowly and with great richness, full of the small things that accumulate into a life. There was something she had meant to tell him for a while, something she had been turning over in the private part of herself that still processed things before she said them out loud. She had told almost no one, not even Agnes. She thought about it now, in the warm barn with her hand in his. "I've been asked," she said, "to submit a proposal to the Territorial Education Board for a teacher training program. They want to establish a formal program for certifying teachers in the territory. They've asked me to help design it." He looked at her. "Would it require you to travel, occasionally, to Santa Fe, to Albuquerque?" He was quiet for a moment. "Would you want to do it?" "I think I would," she said. "I think it's important work. And I think Francis is ready to run the school here without me needing to be present every day." He nodded slowly, the nod that meant he was thinking carefully rather than quickly. "Then you should do it," he said. She looked at him, just like that. been teaching here for 6 years, he said. You know this territory needs better than most, and if you don't do it, someone else will, and they will do it less well. He paused. The children in this territory deserve the best teachers they can get. That's a reason that is larger than either of us. She felt the warmth of this spread through her chest, not the warmth of permission granted, because she had not needed his permission, but the warmth of being understood completely by the person who knew her best. She squeezed his hand. I love you, she said. I know, he said, with the quiet certainty of a man who knows it in every part of his daily life and has stopped being surprised by his own good fortune. I love you. Thomas tugged his father's coat again. Oscar looked down at his son with the particular expression he wore for his children, which was a thing that she had watched develop over 5 years from the cautious wonder of a man who had not expected this into the deep and unshowy devotion of one who could not imagine his life without it. He picked Thomas up with the practiced ease of a man who has carried this child for 5 years, and Thomas immediately pointed at Pete Marsh with the focused interest of a child who had decided that the fiddle was the most interesting object in any room it occupied. Music, Thomas said, with great authority. Yes, Oscar said. Music. He looked at Wilhelmina over their son's head, and she looked back at him, and there was the whole of it between them, the dance and the song and the carpetbag set down on the barn floor, and everything that had followed from that single act of choosing, the house and the children and the work, and the years of learning each other in the daily and unheroic way that genuine love is built. Through coffee in the morning and lamps in the window, and telling the truth even when it was difficult, and being patient with each other's closed windows and frozen doors, and working gently, persistently, over time, until they were both more open than they had been, more full of light, better than they had been before the other person came. She thought about what she would tell the children someday, Thomas and Samuel and whoever else might come, about how two people find each other and build something that lasts. She thought she would tell them that it was not always obvious, that it happened at angles sometimes, and through the accumulation of small things, through a man setting torches along a road and another man's land fraud investigated on principle, and a woman arguing for a woman who was not present to argue for herself. She would tell them that love was not a thing that announced itself fully formed, but a thing that grew in the ordinary spaces between people who paid attention to each other. And she would tell them about a barn dance in March of 1884, and a fiddle stopping mid-note, and a man walking across a floor with his hat in his hands, and 6 words that had changed everything there was to change. One more song is all I need. She smiled in the warm barn light, in Redemption Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1889, with her husband's hand in hers and her son in his arms and her other son sleeping peacefully in the next room of the stone house behind the marshal's office, and the creek running just outside, and the stars coming out over the dark ridges, and all of it exactly right, all of it exactly the life she had not known she was building until it was built. Solid as stone and warm as lantern light, and entirely, irreversibly, gratefully her own. Pete Marsh played on, and the people of Redemption Creek danced, and the night was long and good and full, and no one was counting songs anymore.